Hi and welcome back to the course. In this video we're going to be installing Nginx and running our app. Nginx is what's called a reverse proxy. What that means is that Nginx is going to act as a gateway between our application and external users. It's going to accept incoming requests, and then it's going to decide what to do with those requests. We're going to configure Nginx so those requests go straight to our application. Now you may wonder, well, why do we need that? And I gotta say, that's a good question. Nginx will also do things like communicate with UWSGI to enable multi-threaded operation of our Flask app. It can also do things like allow you to run multiple Flask apps simultaneously in your server, while redirecting incoming requests to different apps, depending on some parameters. So it's overall a nice piece of software to have in your server, and it's very useful, and it's also really fast. So it's not going to slow down your app at all. The first thing to do is to log into your server and then sudo apt-get update. Now, apt-get is going to communicate with the Ubuntu package manager, and it's going to change some stuff. It's going to essentially change the version numbers and things like that. So you have to be root to be able to run this command, and sudo does that. It says run the following command as root. So we're going to press enter, and then we're going to run that command as sudo. And you may have to put in your password, so just do that if that's required. And then sudo apt-get install Nginx. And that's going to install Nginx there. Once again, I'm going to press enter when it asks me if I want to continue. Now that Nginx is installed, you can see that we've set up a bunch of things, and there's one thing that we must do, which is let our firewall have access, let Nginx have access through the firewall, so the incoming requests don't get blocked. So what we're going to do is say sudo ufw status, and ufw is the Ubuntu firewall. And as you can see, it says status inactive, so we're going to enable the firewall to improve the connections. And it says that it may disrupt existing SSH connections, but it doesn't. And finally, we have to give Nginx access. So we're going to do sudo ufw allow Nginx HTTP. And make sure to put that inside quotation marks. And what that's going to do is it's going to put Nginx in the firewall. And that's the rule added. And now if we do sudo ufw status, you can see that Nginx HTTP is allowed. Now, we're going to make sure that Nginx is running, and it should be running. And the way we check that in Ubuntu is with the system controller. So systemctl, status Nginx. And we're going to be using systemctl quite a bit. So it's good to get to know it. And as you can see here, it's active and it's running. So that's all good. There are a bunch of other things we can do with systemctl. We can potentially stop Nginx. We can also start Nginx if it's not running. And we can restart Nginx. So those are a few of the things we can do with the system controller. Okay, now what we're going to do is we're going to go over to the Nginx config, and we're going to add our REST API to the Nginx config. We've not yet put the REST API in the server, but we're going to do that in just a moment. But we're going to add some configuration parameters to Nginx to make sure that it can access our API. So we're going to do sudo vi/etc/nginx/sites available /items-rest.conf. And this is a brand new file which we're creating. And what we're going to do is we're going to press the letter I to go into insert mode, and then we're going to start writing our Nginx config. Now this is going to be a bit long, but please bear with me while I explain exactly what it is. The first part of any Nginx config is the server. What that says is this block here inside these curly braces is a server, essentially a Flask app or something like that. And this server is going to be able to listen to incoming requests and then dispatch them where appropriate. Okay. So this app, this server, is going to listen, apologies for that, it's going to listen on port 80, which is the default HTTP port. Whenever we access a website on the internet, we're accessing on port 80. That's just the default. So listening on port 80 is going to be interesting because it means that users don't have to do something like get mysite.com : The colon will be omitted whenever we access our REST API because the default is port 80. So if we're listening on port 80, we don't have to specify the port number. Next, a couple of configuration parameters. real_IP_header is going to be x-forwarded for, and all that's going to do is it's going to forward the IP address of the requester over to our Flask app. Now, I understand that doesn't make a lot of sense, but it just means that whenever somebody makes a request to our server, Nginx is going to tell our Flask app who made that request. Next, we're going to set the real IP from to be 107.0.0.1. Although Nginx is going to forward the IP address of the requester to our Flask app, it's also going to say that the request really is coming from 127.0.0.1, which, as you know, is localhost, because Nginx is receiving the request, and then it's going to send that request to the Flask app, which is running on localhost, or which will be running on localhost. And to do with that, server_name is going to be localhost. Okay, so some config properties there. Next, we're going to do location /. And what this is going to do is it's going to say whenever somebody accesses the root location of the server, it's going to redirect them somewhere. And where it's going to redirect them is to our Flask app. Okay. So what we have to do is include uwsgi_params. Now, as you know, we're running the app using uwsgi, as you know from the Heroku deployments. And if you don't, then I'll tell you now, we're running the app using uwsgi, which is a program that allows our Flask app to run multi-threaded more efficiently and to restart threads as they fail if they do. And Nginx deals very well with uwsgi. uwsgi is a very complex thing, but we have to include uwsgi_params so that it can communicate with the uwsgi program. Okay, then we're going to do uwsgi_pass, and then we're going to type the following: Unix :/bar/www/html items -rest/socket.sock. What this is doing is it's going to pass to this file all the necessary parameters. And what this file is going to be is this is going to be the connection point between our Flask app and Nginx. So this is really important. We don't have the socket.sock file yet, but we will have it soon. We're going to be creating that. Then we're going to say uwsgi_modifier130. And what this is passing in is a uwsgi parameter that tells the threads when to die if they become blocked. So just a bit of info there. Okay. And then we can add a bunch more stuff here, such as error pages. If we return a 404 code, we can tell Nginx to redirect the user to the 404 page. And we can say location =/404.html. And what this means is when the location is exactly /404.html, do the following. And what we're going to do is say root /usa/share/nginx/html. And what that's going to do is it's going to serve the 404.html page from this folder here, which is /user/share/nginx/html. And nginx comes quite handily with a page called 404.html. So the user is going to see that page if we return a 404. And also we can say error page 500, 502, 503, and 504 go to /50x.html. And we can say if the location is 50x.html, do root/user/share/nginx/html. And once again, if we return error codes 500, 502, 503, or 504, we're going to serve the 50x.html page, which is going to tell the user that an internal error occurred. I appreciate that this is particularly confusing, and the first few times that I had to do this, I had no clue what was going on, but I just knew it worked. And if you want to delve into the depths of what this all means, then you'll have to go and investigate about the WSGI protocol and how these applications connect to the receiving server, which can be something like Apache or something like Nginx. You don't have to worry about that, because when you do this, it will work. So I've chosen not to delve into any of the UWSGI concepts. They get confusing very quickly. But just know that that is essentially what's happening here. Whenever we access any page, we're going to go through to the Flask app, except if we go to the 404 and 50x endpoints, or sort of, and then we're going to serve those pages. And then what we're doing here is we're listening on port 80, which is the default port for HTTP connections. And then we're passing in who requested the page. We're also passing in localhost, which is actually the Nginx server. And then we're passing in localhost, which is the Nginx server again. Once we've written all of this stuff here, we're going to press escape and then :WQ to write and quit. And that's our Nginx config being made available. However, it's not being enabled. We have to enable the config, and the way we'll do that is by doing sudo ln space -s space /etc/nginx sites available items rest.conf, and then space /etc nginx sites enabled. Okay, so what this is doing is it's going to create a link, a soft link, between the config file we just created and the sites enabled folder where Nginx reads the config properties. So we're going to do that. Okay. Now that we've done that, Nginx will know about our config file, and it will try to access that socket file. That socket file doesn't yet exist, but we're going to make sure that it does in a moment. The next thing we're going to do is sudo mkdir /var /www/html /items-rest. Remember, we used this folder in the config file. This is where our application is going to live. Now, something interesting to remember is we've created this directory as the root user, which means our user, Jose, is not going to have access to that directory. So we have to make sure to give the directory to the Jose user. And what that is make the Jose user the owner of that directory. So the way we do that is sudo chown change owner Jose :Jose /var www.html items-rest. So we're going to change the owner of this directory to the Jose user and to the Jose group, as opposed to the root user and the root group. Okay. Now we're going to go into that directory. And now, as you can see, we are in that directory. And the next thing we have to do is to clone our Python app. So I'm going to use the same app as we used in the Heroku section, in the last section. Okay? So I'm just going to go ahead and copy that. And I'm going to paste it in here. I'm going to explain exactly what I'm doing. What I'm going to do is git clone the https://github.com/schoolofcode-me/stores-rest-api.git. So that's the GitHub repository with the stores REST API that we deployed in the last section. And after that, I'm going to put a space and a full stop. And that means clone all the items into this folder here. Okay. And there we have, we've now cloned it. Okay. Now, in order to be able to produce logs for our app, we're going to have to create a directory called log. So just do mkdir log. Because we own this folder, we own the items-rest folder, the Jose user owns it, we don't have to use sudo anymore, and indeed you shouldn't use sudo, just do mkdir log. Okay, now I'm going to press ls, and you can see that we've got a bunch of things here, which are all our application files, as well as the log folder. Okay. The next thing, we have to install a bunch of Python-related things that we're going to need. So we're going to do sudo apt-get install, and the first thing we're going to install is pip, the Python package manager, so python-pip. Then we're going to install a set of tools that Python needs to be able to compile from source. So we're going to do python 3-dev, and what that is going to allow us is to install things like uwsgi and psychopg, which is needed for SQL Alchemy. And finally, we're going to install libpq-dev, which again is going to allow us to run psychopg2. So we're going to install all that. And this may take a wee while. Now that's finished, we are ready to proceed, and we have to first install virtualenv. So we're going to use pip to install virtualenv. And as you know, a virtual environment is just another Python installation that doesn't have the libraries that the main Python installation has. So we're going to use virtualenv for this project, so we don't pollute the main Ubuntu Python installation with our libraries. We're going to create a virtual environment within the same folder, and the way we do that is with virtualenv, then the name of the folder which is going to host our virtual environment, I'm calling it venv, and then --python equal Python 3.5. Ubuntu comes with Python 3.5, which is great. We don't have to install it ourselves. Apologies for that. Now that we have created the virtual environment, we can see that it is there inside the same folder as everything else. And now we're going to go into the virtual environment by doing source space then bin activate. Now, remember, we are in Unix right now, so even if you're running this terminal in Windows, you're still going to have to run source vm bin activate. And then we're going to be in the VM. Finally, the last thing to do is to install -r the requirements.txt. So we're going to do pip install -r requirements.txt. And what that's going to do is it's going to get all of the requirements from the requirements.txt file, and it's going to install them in this virtual environment. Remember, all of these files were created in the last section in the Heroku deployments. Okay, so what this has done is it has installed Flask, Flask JWT, Flask SQL Alchemy, uwsgi, psychopg2, It's Dangerous, which is part of Flask, and ISO 8601, which is for dates and the ISO standard, SQL Alchemy, and Markup Safe, which is also part of Flask. So it's installed everything that we need to run our app. Okay. Now the next thing we have to do is set up uwsgi so that our application can communicate with uwsgi and Nginx can communicate with uwsgi to create a complete chain. And we're going to do that in the next video because this one is getting pretty long. And so yeah. So if you have any problems up until now, let me know. It's very important that we don't get stuck in here. Without further ado, I'll see you in the very next video.